Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. My name is Peg Siciliano. I'm the board president of the Traverse Area Historical Society. As we have a few visitors in the audience today, I'll give a quick overview of our organization. We're a nonprofit 501c3. Our mission is to preserve, protect, and present the history of the Grand Traverse region, and that's that third part of our mission you'll hear today. Our activities include programs, historical tours, archive support, scholarship support, and support of local initiatives to preserve our local history. We are an all-volunteer organization, and we have no paid positions. Our revenues from membership and donations are what allow us to put on programs like this today. Today's program is entitled Rutted Dirt to Interstates, Tents to Motels, How Roads and Lodging Changed Between the 1910s and the 1970s. Peg Siciliano will be our presenter. She has written and presented extensively on local history topics, holds a master's degree in history from the College of William and Mary in Virginia, and has served years as the archivist in the History Center of Traverse City. The program today will present through the vintage of many photographs that you'll see from Peg's presentation. We will be on three, yes? Oh. Okay, sorry. Right, I'll just continue. No, that's right. The audience will be treated to three tourist excursions up north. The first in the 1910s, the next in the 1940s, and then finally the last in the 1960s. The changes have certainly occurred, and you will get that to see that in Peg's presentation. And so without further ado, I'll bring Peg up. Thank you.
I have high tech also because I couldn't find a laser pointer. So if I want to point to the screen, I'm going to be using something very similar to point to the screen. So anyway, welcome everyone here. Spring has been in the air, although not so much today. And that means it's about time for all of those that live here to start hooking up those figurative seat belts and getting ready for the tourists to come into town. Of course, that may be particularly challenging this year with all that minor rebuild that's going on Front Street. While some modern day visitors will arrive at the Cherry Capital Airport, a large percentage will travel by car, sweeping into town on paved highways, although perhaps encountering a few potholes and gingerly negotiating those newfangled roundabouts. Yet even given roundabouts and potholes, today's roads are a notable improvement from what was available at the start of automobile travel in the 1900s. And lodging for travelers has also changed a lot. Today, we will be looking at those changes, envisioning three bygone road trips. One in the 19-teens, one in the 1940s, and the last one in the 1960s. The photo at the top left is taken pretty much in front of what now is Fifth Third Bank. It's on Front Street, I think it's 1913, looking east on Front. The middle photograph is sometime in the 1940s, looking the other direction, west on Front Street, and you can see the bank sort of in the middle there in the far distance. And the third one looks, I knew this before, you're looking east on Front Street, and that sort of white building off to the right is Milliken's department store. It was on the corner of Cass and Front Street. The building is still there, and today the bottom floor is Espresso Bay Coffee. But now we're going to move into that 19-teens, the touring pioneers. The advent of auto tourism in the 1910s came at a crucial time for Northern Michigan. The lumber boom was over and jobs were disappearing. In fact, Traverse City suffered a fairly serious recession or depression in the teens because the lumbering industry had left and there wasn't that much coming back in to replace it. So the left-hand photo is just some general ruins from somewhere around Traverse City. The right-hand photo is the closed starch factory, which sat on the end of West Bay, about where Division Street runs into what is today Grandview Parkway. Luckily, at that time, Americans were beginning their love affair with the automobile. Granted, visitors had been arriving by boat and train for decades. This is a Hannah and Leigh boat called the TAHS Paxton, and it went back and forth from Chicago carrying cargo and passengers. And this is a photograph of people leaving from the Pier Marquette station, which sat at about 6th and Union on the east side of Union Street. And this was taken in 1915, so just as cars were beginning to make their appearance. One thing that helped expand road travel up north was the development of Henry Ford's Model T Ford. I believe this is a Model T. I know there's people out there that are more expert on cars than I am, but this is definitely a Ford. And it greatly expanded the ability for people to travel because it was inexpensive for the day and a lot of people could afford it. At the time, both government and private business realized that bringing tourism north would be one way to help bolster the economy. So they began to purposely encourage more and more people to drive north along the beauty of the Lake Michigan shoreline to help the economy. In the 19-teens, hardy motorists, likely driving this Ford car or one very like it, traveled on dirt roads that hadn't changed much since the 1880s. That Ford would spend much of its time sunk up to its hubcaps in either mud or sand, depending on the weather. And to those who weren't too happy about the advent of the automobile, I'm sure they would get a chuckle out of this situation when they had to go out and pull those cars out of the problems that they encountered on those roads. As you will hear, problems with Michigan's roads are nothing new. Until the turn of the 20th century, almost all road work was managed on a township level, although a few longer roads, those connecting far-flung towns, were built with state or even federal money. Hence, there was great lack of coordination between jurisdictions. And actually, that doesn't sound too unfamiliar to today from what I read in the paper, that there's still problems connecting what the townships and the counties and the cities and the state want done. So everything that's old comes around again. This roadblock to good roads was compounded by a hesitancy to accept professional construction standards. For most of the 19th century, landowners had fulfilled their obligation to the state, either by paying with money or by providing manual labor to build roads. So the idea was sort of at the time, if you had a plow and a horse, you knew enough to build a road. So for many decades, the phrase road improvement was a bit of an oxymoron. One commentator wrote, "The experienced traveler who finds himself at the beginning of a newly mended road will betake himself to the nearest house and learn how far that improvement extends. If, for example, it goes for 10 miles, he will then inquire by what circuit, not exceeding 15 miles in length, he can escape the danger of those repairs. After a time, nature will mend the damage done by the process of reconstruction, and then the journey person may find again a way tolerable to travel." Comments from the early 20th century reveal that Governor Gretchen Whitmer's rallying cry to fix the damn roads has deep Michigan roots. Horatio S. Earl was a prominent early 20th century Michigan good roads proponent, and he lobbied hard for better roadways. In one of his pleas, he stated that he wanted things to change so that when people were traveling north from other areas, they wouldn't say, oh, we know we're in Michigan now because the roads are really bad. And so I've literally noticed that when I travel, like from Illinois or Indiana or even Ohio, you get over the Michigan line and things are a little bit bumpier. So again, some things don't completely change. So he really was a strong proponent for improving those roads. On the other side of the road improvement issue, at least for a while, were many Michigan farmers. When horseless carriages first came on the scene, many urban dwellers saw them as a novelty rather than a workhorse to replace, well, the horse. Hence, the automobile's impact was first felt in rural areas where it was used for touring and recreation. Rural citizens were rightfully upset when these tourist drivers would rut unpaved roads, kick up dust, and frighten or even injure livestock. Such attitudes, among other issues, meant road improvements were slow to appear. We can get a sense of how much things have changed by hearing the experience of Julius Beers of Traverse City. In 1911, Beers motored home after attending the Ann Arbor University. This is from a newspaper article, and that's what they referred to the University of Michigan as the Ann Arbor University. The paper records that Beers arrived home at 8 p.m. on a Friday after having started from Hastings at 7 a.m. the previous morning. So that means it took him 35 hours to complete what today would take 3 or 4 hours. So he obviously spent the night, or hopefully spent the night somewhere in between. I couldn't find a picture of Julius Beers from 1911, but he is the fourth person here in the straw hat. And who was a very famous baseball player, played in the pros in the teens and the 20s, I believe, and then dropped back down to the minors and is still one of the very best minor league baseball players that ever played. But he was, wasn't born here, but he grew up in Traverse City. And so there's Julius Beers many years later with his straw hat on. That is a 1930s picture of the largest cherry pie in the world for the Cherry Pie Festival. Beers and others traveling on those roads back in 1911 often spent a lot of their time digging their automobiles out of the sand or mud. This is one reason why travelers often did not stay in the hotels and motels that were already established at that time. They had to stay somewhere because it was impossible to get from one place to another, even between hotels in one day. And in 1913, most hotels didn't have parking lots because they were used to people coming in on those boats or by train or by horse. And also, a lot of those hotels were actually quite upscale establishments. So this is a photo of the Park Place Hotel when it was a white clapboard facility. That would stay that way until about 1929 when it was torn, 28, 29 when it was torn down and the brick, 13-story brick hotel that we have today was built. But what would happen is the proprietors and other people staying in these rather nice hotels would not be very happy when these travelers and the teens would come in and they'd be all muddy and dusty and tracking mud all over the road and maybe not smelling really great if they've been out for days traveling. So a lot of them would end up tenting along the way. So here are two photographs of people tenting with their, what we now think of as old style cars along the way. And they are Michigan photographs. So it was quite an adventure to take a trip cross country at those times. So these motorists had to be a hardy bunch for whom the challenges were probably part of the reason they decided to take the trip. They enjoyed that. But those state government officials and local boosters and private entrepreneurs realized that if they want to expand the number of people who were traveling, they would have to have better accommodations for them rather than everybody having to camp along the way to come up. So they decided to really work hard at improving the roads. And we're going to get into that. But before we get into how they were improved, I just want to point out that many of those roads, although they were very rough to travel, were built on at very good locations because they were built on old Indian trails that had come up for hundreds of years, if not thousands. And this is a photograph of some of those old Indian trails. And many of the roads that were built and improved in the 20th century follow many of these very same routes. And same can be said today. Now the interstates follow those routes. It's not one-on-one. They aren't all following an Indian route, but many of them are. So many of those routes were originally developed by the Native Americans. But they knew they needed better roads. So in 1912, the West Michigan Pike Association formed, and its purpose was to have a continuous hard surface road from New Buffalo to Mackinac City. Because this is what the roads looked like before the improved roads. And by the mid-1920s, that paved road existed. It came up from New Buffalo. Not sure which Buffalo. It come right through Traverse City. Probably not on this map. Without this. Okay, thank you. Indeed. Yeah, okay. One of those I states, right? Got it. Okay. The other thing it did was it decided to, it was one of the reasons why the state got into the state park business. Because the state parks, although it'd still be tenting, would have other facilities, running water, that type of thing, which would be much more pleasant than just having to pull off alongside a road and pitch up your own tent out in the middle of nowhere. And Traverse City has two of the very early state parks. Oops, here's, this is a picture of the West Michigan Pike. And it was also called the Highway. So that's an early advertising, tourist advertising brochure or place card for the West Michigan Pike. And here we can see the cars traveling alongside of it. The upper left-hand photograph is of Interlochen State Park. And Interlochen State Park had been founded before the state by a couple of years, before the state got into the state park business. They purchased the already existing Interlochen State Park in 1917, folded it into the new state system in 1919. The Traverse City State Park opened in 1919 as a state park. And the bottom right-hand picture is a picture of what is now Highway 31 going around the end of East Bay, which looks much different. And the park must be off, I'm assuming, to the left in that. Yeah, okay, thank you. So your 19 teens tourists coming towards Traverse City probably would have been in a Model T Ford. Very likely would have had to either tent along the way or just go ahead and bother all those people in those nice hotels and walk right into the lobby, no matter how dirty or messy they were. And towards the end, they would have had the state parks to stay in. So now we're going to move into the 1940s. Campgrounds were still around in the 1940s, but you wouldn't have been probably not driving a Model T Ford. Two of the more popular cars at the time would have been sedans. This is a Chevrolet Deluxe up in the left and a Ford Deluxe down on the right. They were two of the more popular types of cars that were available in the 40s. And before 1940s, the entrepreneurs had decided to start filling that gap between camping and staying in a hotel. And this is what they came up with originally. This is not, as far as I know, it's not a Michigan photograph. I couldn't find something quite this simple from the Traverse City area, but it is, if you can read, it says cabins up in the upper left, and they were very, very rough, obviously, probably no running water, no heat, but it was easier than having to set up your own tent when you were stopping along the way. So those were sort of the first roadside motels that popped up in the 20s. As demand for lodging increased, competition led to further improvements. So in trying to draw in business, people started adding heat, electricity when they could, or running water. They started putting flower boxes on their cabins, started sprucing the whole thumb, and eventually it became too expensive to stretch them out alongside the road. So that's where that U-shaped design that many of us, there's still some cabins in Traverse City that I know of, but they aren't, if the U shape isn't there anymore. And when I moved here in the 1980s, there were still a few of those cabin facilities that were being used. And that I think the one like on Veterans Drive still was sort of shaped in a U. And there are still a few cabins left in town. And I'll talk about those in just a minute. So by the 1930s, they were organized into motor carts, usually U-shaped. In Traverse City, motorists would have a wide choice of these places to go stay at. Several were strung along East Front Street. So here we have the Traveltel Hotel up in the upper left-hand corner. It was at 731 East Front Street. Not sure where Locust Beach was. I think it was East Bay, but that's the bottom left-hand. And then the Shadowland cabins were at the corner of Fair and Munson Street. And then those of you that have lived here for a while, I believe there was a Shadowland bar there in the 50s. I'm seeing a head shaking. Good. So I don't know when the cabins left, but in this up until the 60s or 70s, maybe even early 80s, there was a bar on that corner, which is now, I believe, where the Dennis Museum is, where the statue, where the sculpture is. Across the street? Okay, thank you. Across the street from there. And this is a picture of the Pine Lane cabins, which sat and were extant. I don't know if they were used as cabins, but they were there, and I'd say up until 15 years ago or so. And they were on the west side of Veterans Drive, just as you got to 14th Street. If you look at a 1940s directory, they say that they are located, these Pine Lane cabins are located at the intersection of 14th and 31. Well, today, if we thought of the intersection of 14th and 31, we would think of Division Street and 14th Street. But that's not where US 31 came in until the early 50s when Grandview Parkway was built. So before that, the corner of US 31 and 14th Street would have been what is now Veterans Drive and 14th Street, or at that time would have been Ready. Photograph that. So at that time, US 31 would have come in, and they still hear me now. Oh, I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
Okay. So at 14th Street, US 30, and in the 40s, 31 would have come in from Chum's Corner to 14th Street, east to Union, down Union to Front Street. Front Street was two-way, and so then it would go out along East Bay in Traverse City. So that has changed a lot over the last 50 years. In the early 1950s, Grandview Parkway was put in, and at that time, the highway came all the way down Division Street to the bay. By the 1940s, should I keep this or I'm not sure? Okay, I'll use this, then I can move around. By the 1940s, those rutted dirt long distance roads of the 19 teens had long been replaced by 2-lane roads rather similar to many of our county roads today. Coming from the south and west, travel might well have been on US 31. This is the same route that was earlier called the West Michigan Pike, and which in 1926 had been designated US 31. If you were coming from the southeast, you'd be driving on US highways, might be Highway 2, Highway 10, 24, 25, 27, and these roads had been designated US highways in the 1920s. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these roads lay on paths that had earlier been Indian trails. 1960s, fast roads and modern motels. By the 1960s, many of these roads, mostly 2-lane, thoroughfares, had been replaced by limited access highways. Many of these freeways were designed for limited access with nationally unified standards for construction. This idea was solidified during the Eisenhower administration with the Federal Highway Act of 1956. So when Eisenhower was serving as Supreme Commander in Europe, he noticed how bogged down all the military traffic got on those 2-lane roads over there. And it made it very hard to prosecute the war without being able to move things around. So when he became president, he came back and he thought, middle of the Cold War, if we had to move all that military stuff across this huge country that we have here on the 2-lane road system that we have, we'd be facing the same problem we faced in Europe during the war. And so one of the impetus for building what right now we think of as our interstate highway wasn't to get you and I back to our parents' house in New York or wherever. It was for those military transports to be able to get around if we were under attack or if we needed to move them quickly. Of course, supporting transportation and tourism is something that luckily we've never had to use them very often for military problems, but they certainly have enhanced speed, if not the experience of traveling. In Michigan, this resulted in us getting freeways like I-75, I-94, I-96. Construction on I-75 started in 1957. Signs went up in 59, and I-75 was completed in 1973. Visitors heading north in the 60s may well have been driving popular cars of the time, like a Rambler station wagon up on the left, or a Chevrolet Impala, both of which there's a blue one there. Oh, the 2 Ramblers, the white and the blue, and then the Impala is down on the right. 2 of the most popular cars of that decade. These new car models and road configurations were joined by new lodging choices. During World War II, it had been really hard to find materials to build new facilities. So building individual cabins was expensive. It was cheaper to lay down one long flat slab of concrete and hook all those rooms together into what I would call a motel as versus a hotel or as versus cabins. These photographs are of the Bayshore Resort. Oh, yeah, where are we? Oh, this is the Terrace Beach Motel at 841 East Front. Could have stayed there. And what I remember from that, being old enough, is that when you pulled up after a long day of travel, when I did with my parents, when my parents pulled up, you didn't have to pull up to the front door of the hotel and find a cart to push your stuff in or pay a bellboy to haul it up. You could just pull up, back up to the door, sort of toss everything into your room, and you were done and you were ready to go in and go to sleep. So this is the Parkview Hotel. No, this is the Terrace Beach Hotel. I also wanted to talk about these two because they're still there. Back here, there's the Terrace Beach Motel, and these are both on Front Street, and the Island View Cottages, which are cottages, not a motel. So they're still operating today. I think they tend to operate as like weekly rentals or even monthly rentals, but they're still there. I also like the story of the Parkview Motel, which was at 825 East Front. It first hosted tourist cabins, which you can see still in the back of this photograph. You can still see the cabins back there. And then a motel section that was built in front of them. And today it is the location of the Bayshore Resort. So that one spot of land has, I don't know if anyone ever tented there, but it does have the cabins, it has the motel, and now it has more of a modern day resort, all sitting at the same location on the bay. By 1966, even the iconic Park Place had jumped onto the motoring bandwagon. And before I show you a picture of that in the 1960s, I just want to point out a local road change. This is a 1940s aerial of the Park Place Hotel, the brick 13-story hotel that opened in 1929, just on the cusp of the Great Depression. But it managed with a lot of help from local people to stay open. This is Park Street. This is State Street. This is Park Street going south. And as you can see, it goes all the way to the river. Today, it cuts off here. And this area here is built in. And this is all parking. So it's just that whole little chunk of Traverse City has changed significantly over the last 40, 50 years. So when you look at this photograph, this is in the 1960s. So this, where we go in today, and that's where this is, the front door of the Park Place, it became the Park Place Motor Inn. And that was bought and operated by the Power family for a while, and then of Power Island. And then eventually the Park Place has had a few ups and downs in its life, but the Rotary stepped in the late 1990s and did a whole redo, and I believe it's doing quite well now. But if you look back, you can see the changes that have occurred to that. And that's the hotel today. So that's my initial go through of those slides. Did anybody see anything that they had a question about? Any questions about what has occurred? I have one. Oh, sure. Go right ahead. Yeah. Let me bring this back to you though. Just a minute, because there are people online.
I know you mentioned Dixie Highway.
Yep.
Were you aware that if you're driving north on 31 and you go past Torch Lake, to your left, there'll be a sign that says Old Dixie Road, and you need to turn on that and you'll be transported back to the 1920s because it's a 2-lane road. It used to be part of the Dixie Highway. It's paved, yes, with asphalt, but it's a joy to drive along that road. And the other thing I wanted to talk about, the gas stations would give out maps, but that was only starting about 1940 or so. before that time in the 1920s, they had something called blue books. Now, a blue book, for some people, you think, oh, that tells us how much a used car is worth. And that's true. But in the 1920s, a blue book would give you directions how to go from one place to another. And in this library's collection, we have a blue book dating from 1922, maybe, for this area. So if you'd ever like to check out how to go from Traverse City to Northport and buy that blue book, you can look it up and they'll tell you, you go 2 miles and then you make a left at the cemetery. Then you go another 3 miles and you pass the railroad tracks and you make a right and so on. That's the way it would tell you how to get to Northport. And it's really quite fun to check out that blue book and see how to get to places locally. That's pretty much what I wanted to say.
No, it's a great addition. And I didn't touch on this at the beginning, but way back in the 1850s, 60s, we also had stagecoaches that came up. The Newaygo Road, which came up from Newaygo, was one of the earliest roads built from the south coming up, and the stagecoaches would come up from there. And the Campbell House, which the picture I showed of the Park Place when it was a white building, it was originally built as the Campbell House. And Mr. Campbell also owned a stagecoach line that he owned. He was vertically integrating his business so that he would be bringing people in and they had a place to stay. So, yes. Oh, I'm supposed to get this.
Was one, and as you said, the Newaygo Road based on an Indian trail? And if so, did it have a name?
That I would have to look back on my map, which is not complete, but let me just look back and see what we can see on that. Or some people are watching you. It's always hard to get your computer to work, and we're going to go back to that. They don't show one going up that side. Does anyone, I know I've got a lot of historical knowledge sitting in here. Anyone else know anything about that, Fred? That's okay.
By the late 1850s, there was a trail that ran from here to Ludington because Perry Hanna took it on his way to Lansing. I mean, it wasn't direct, but on the other hand, there were no roads at all, but there was an Indian trail. An Indian guide took him down that far because he had to hike to the state legislature.
I knew that Perry Hanna had hiked out of here in the 1850s. I had no idea what route he had taken, but Fred has a ton of knowledge, and I certainly believe he knows. So this is a map I got off of the internet, and I've seen, like, there's a 1930s atlas that has these trails in it. And I'm sure the ones that are on here did exist. I don't know how thorough it is.
I could add just a little bit to that. That was technically called the Newaygo to Northport Road because it went all the way on up to Northport. It was mired pretty badly when it was being built and they couldn't get it up there. The governor took a liking to Perry Hanna and put him in charge. And in less than 2 years, Perry had that thing finished, with the last piece being the bridge over the Manistee River. Once that was there, now you got a lot of stagecoaches and hiking and whatnot through that. That would have come into Traverse City by what we call Silver Lake Road, just to the south of the state hospital, and then went up Division, turned left, and it actually didn't go up 22 as we know it. It turned on Cherry Bend Road and then went up along Lake Leelanau. So
Yeah. And I was watching the time, and obviously I went faster than I thought I was going to, but I can go back to these roads change. I know I've looked at maps of Traverse City and like in the what I call the new Slab Town, because historically Slab Town was like between on the east side of Division, like 4th Street towards the bay, but now we also refer to Slabtown, and it refers to itself as being on the west side of Division, all like where Slabtown burgers are. But Grandview Parkway was not built until the late 1950s and early 1950s. And before that, Bay Street continued east of Division and went east towards what is now the Del Mar Hotel. But that whole area was old industry, or not at the time they weren't old. It was factories, railroad yards. You could take Bay Street partway up, and then it just stopped, I think, about where Clinch Park is today. And when I first moved here, people kept telling me there were all these manufacturing plants down on the bay. And I would look from the edge of Grandview Parkway to the bay and think, how the heck did they put all those manufacturing companies between the parkway and the bay? Well, it was because the parkway wasn't there. And so that manufacturing area stretched from the Boardman River to the bay, that whole section there. Yes.
Yeah, and you mentioned that 31 came in on what is now Veterans Drive and then Front Street and East, but 72 came across Front, went north on Elmwood, and then went through West Greilicville and then connected to Cherry Bend and on up to Sutton's Bay that way. There's no shore road. And Bay Street, I think, just sort of petered out west of Division. I mean, it ended at the Morgan Freight Yard, which would be where the downtown parking is now. And the rest of it was trains.
I was just going to say Bay Street actually stopped at Union Street at the north terminus, where you would run into the Morgan McCool, or today the open space. There was a small little spur that ran east of Union Street, looked like it would be a continuation of Bay Street, but it was called Barker Street, and it kind of meandered behind the zoo and over to a Cass.
Another change for those who would visit here in the 1960s, if you had visited here in the 1940s into the 50s, Front Street would have been two-way. And Front Street was two-way until the mid 1960s, and then 68. Yeah. April. Okay, this is those two shouldn't sit next to each. They're both right. If I remember correctly, I think in 67, the city decided to do a trial, and they made it 55 was a trial, and then they waited a few years to change it. Okay. How many people remember? If you don't mind showing your age, how many people remember it being two-way? We've got a couple in here. Yeah. So I've had people tell me about cruising down Front Street, which wouldn't have had anything to do with whether it was two-way or one-way. But my kids were asking me what I did when I was in high school. They're now in their like early 30s, somewhere in that age. And I said, well, we went cruising. I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska. And we used to pile in a car, like 8 teenagers in a car, and drive all over town waiting to find somebody else. We called it cruising. Well, my kids, I guess to them, the word cruising sort of meant driving around trying to pick up ladies of the night, shall we say. And that's how they said, what? You were doing what? And I'm like, driving around in a car. And it just was a funny, like, miscommunication between their generation and mine. I showed some change in cars, which is sort of obvious. They changed during the years. Does anyone have any comments on car changes? Yeah, well, we have a little time. Yeah,
Did you mention Frank Hamilton and his importance in making roads around here?
I did not use his name. Some of the photographs were Frank Hamilton.
Okay. I'm a person who likes to try to find things left over from the past. And if you go to the Garfield Township Town Hall, which is up Veterans Drive just beyond the city limits, you will find in a little what should I say, a little cove with white cedar trees, you'll find a monument to Frank Hamilton, and it recognizes his contributions to paved roads in this area. So if ever you pass that Garfield Township Hall, give a stop and see if you can find that. It's kind of cool. And one other thing, do any of you remember Jenny Arnold? Do you remember Arnold's bookstore on Union Street? Well, Jenny's name before Arnold was Waterman. And in 1908, I believe, she took a trip from, it wasn't Traverse City, north of Traverse City, to Niagara Falls in a primitive automobile. And she wrote that up. And I believe the Grand Traverse Journal, the librarians here can help you find that. I believe there's an article, or we reprinted her account of this trip from up north to Niagara Falls. And it's really illuminating to see what it was like to travel at that early time. That's all I had to say.
Visions. I think I will end by going back to a couple of the Frank Hamilton photographs that I used when I was the archivist for the Historical Society. I can't remember who donated it, but we ended up with a photo album that had just like probably 100 photographs of not very early 1900 photographs of road building in the Traverse City area, which is how I know this is a Grand Traverse County photograph that we have right here. And that photo album originally belonged to Frank Hamilton. So that would be in the archives here at the library somewhere. And just amazing how they use the horses. And they use horse-drawn machinery still to help pull the logs out and things to build these roads, which is pretty cool. Any other comments? No? Okay, I see. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Are you coming up here? No, he's not. Okay. So we do have cookies, shamrock cookies, and a little bit of drink there. You're welcome to help yourself to that. And I appreciate your coming out on this St. Patrick's Day.